Good evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Patrick McCauley. As a member of the advisory committee of the Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College, I would like to welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. A particularly warm welcome to the many who are here for the first time. The Institute of Religion and Science was established 13 years ago to promote the constructive engagement of religion and spirituality with science and technology, and to encourage a dialogue that is interfaith, multi-science, and civil. To this end, we sponsor lectures, a reading circle, and other events. Do check our website for resources, particularly for past videos and for our blog. Also, be sure to sign up for our mailing list in order to help you stay aware of upcoming programs. I will now pass things off to Sister Kathy Duffy, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
So good evening and welcome to the Institute for Religion and Science. As Patrick has just mentioned, we have been providing these lectures as well as 2 monthly reading circles for the last almost 13 years. I think our anniversary will be probably in the fall. And it's such a great pleasure, a real pleasure to welcome you tonight. This is our second event of the 2024 season, and there will be more to come. So be sure to, look on our website and look at the mailings we send. If you're not on the mailing list, please somehow figure out, I'll explain how to do that at the end. But be sure to let me know your interest in that. So this evening, it's a very great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker. Dr. Margaret Blackie, also known as Mags, is a spiritual director, scientist, and educator. She holds a faculty position in the Department of Chemistry and Polymer Science at Stellenbosch University near Cape Town in South Africa, and a position as research assistant in the Faculty of Theology. She practiced as a spiritual director in the United Kingdom for 4 years before returning to South Africa. She is the author of Rooted in Love, Integrating Ignatian Spirituality into Daily Life. Currently, her major challenge is to hold together medicinal chemistry, science education, and Ignatian spirituality, and to allow cross-pollination among them rather than having them seem as disparate fields. Mags recharges by walking in the mountains of beautiful Western Cape Town. This evening, Mags will share with us some insights about conversation. In these days, when we experience such polarization, and polarization seems to permeate every single conversation one can think of, it will be a delight to hear what Mags can teach us about listening and conversing and becoming one. We're so lucky to be able to have Mags with us this evening. She's usually in Cape Town, and the time difference is terrible. She'll be up in the middle of the night trying to talk, but she's luckily here in the States for a home visit. And so we're really happy that we were able to schedule this. So Mags, we are all anxious to hear your reflections on this important topic. So welcome to the Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathy, and thanks so much for that kind introduction. As I discussed with Kathy, we met virtually a couple of weeks ago and spoke about various things that I could speak about. And so the focus of this talk is a paper, in fact, that I wrote for The Way that was published last year, which was looking at the intersection of spiritual conversation and intellectual conversation. And so I'm going to begin in that space about sort of exploring wonder. The title of the talk I've given is Exploring Wonder in Intellectual Conversation. And so it's probably helpful just to, Kathy's already given me a little bit of an introduction, but it probably helpful if you know where I've come from, as to explain kind of why my mind ends up thinking about these sorts of things. So this picture was a photograph I took myself back in 2004. What's in the background is an unusual view of Table Mountain. Normally you see it from the front, and that sort of iconic, the iconic picture of Table Mountain is taken from the front of the mountain. Here it's taken from the back of the mountain, and that sort of the buildings that you can see in the foreground is the University of Cape Town, where I did my PhD in chemistry, and I graduated in 2002 with that degree. While I was doing that, in the course of doing my PhD, I also made the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. It's really I like to think of the spiritual exercise as a school for discernment. It really helps you to, certainly it helped me. I was very young when I began the spiritual exercises. Was certainly very young when I encountered Ignatian spirituality, and really my coming into adulthood and my exploration of Ignatian spirituality sort of happened simultaneously. And so the framing, much of my spiritual and intellectual framing comes, I made the spiritual exercises while I was doing my PhD. It tells you a lot about the way in which my intellectual and spiritual framings are kind of infused with Ignatian spirituality. After that, as Kathy said, I then ended up in the United Kingdom, and I worked at this place, which was then a Jesuit retreat house, a place called Loyola Hall, which was in a little village called Rain Hill, which is situated somewhere between Liverpool and Manchester. Unfortunately, the retreat house no longer exists as a retreat house. But I spent 4 years there working. I trained as a spiritual director there, and then spent 4 years giving the spiritual exercises, but mostly giving 8-day retreats. And the experience of giving 8-day retreats, sort of, I want to say week after week, but you sort of a couple of times a month, was such a formative experience for me of really learning to listen. So when I first began, I confess, I was, I like to say now, I was quite young. I was 27 at the time that I began this work. And I remember in the beginning when somebody, so the classic thing would be somebody would come in, you'd never met them before, they would tell you a little bit of their story. And the first few retreats, I'd think, oh, I know what this is about. I know what's going to happen here. And I learned quite quickly that the initial conversation doesn't give you any insight at all into what's really going to happen. I learned quite quickly that really one just needs to wait and to notice the movement of the Spirit of God, and to notice the moments of energy, to notice the moments where the person comes to life, or to notice the moments of greatest emotion. And inevitably on day 4 or day 5 or day 6, something would happen. And I go, now I know what the retreat is about. I thought I knew before. In the beginning, I'd be like, oh, I thought I knew before. Now, now I really know. Over time, I stopped trying to predict. I was just happy to be along for the ride. And I took my job as director as paying particular forms of attention. And it's really that paying attention in a certain kind of a way, which is the substance of tonight's talk. What is that particular kind of a way? And how does that shape conversation? So I then returned to Cape Town and returned to chemistry. It turns I had sort of left chemistry thinking that I would move into full-time ministry, and found myself in my 4th year at Loyola Hall, somewhat to my surprise, missing the scientist in me. And so I returned back to the University of Cape Town to start off with, to do 2 postdocs, and then finally ended up at Stellenbosch University, which is where I worked for 12 years in the Department of Chemistry and Polymer Science. And realizing in sort of the 2018, 2019, that had really, as I held these different strings together, the other thing that I did over those years, beginning in some guys earlier on, but very formally starting in 2018, was to start up and run a spiritual direction training program, which again, I was involved in that program for 5 years before having to stop formally teaching on that program, but I now still sit on the advisory board for that program. So I've held together for a long time this sort of notion of being an active spiritual director and being a full-time academic. And those two worlds have really cross-pollinated in a particular way. And so what I want to talk about a little bit this evening is so just stepping back, I was going to say I want to talk about spiritual conversation, but I realized I just want to step back a little bit and say formally, for those of you who know something about the spiritual direction literature, I was formed very much in the spirit of this book by William Barry, Bill Barry and William Connolly, The Practice of Spiritual Direction. And the thing that this book takes extremely seriously, and that the authors encourage one to take extremely seriously, is the actual presence of God. So spiritual direction is not a conversation about one's prayer life so much as it is exploring who God is for you now, which is obviously informed and shaped by one's prayer life, but it is, that there's that crucial little prayer in the spiritual exercises. In fact, it's a preparation for prayer in the spiritual exercises, where Saint Ignatius writes, or the transcribers of the exercises write, pause for a moment for the space of an Our Father before you're going to enter your prayer space, and notice how God our Lord is looking at you. And it's such a crucial thing because that word notice is pivotal. It isn't imagine how God is looking at me, it's notice how God is looking at me. And so this school of spiritual direction, if you like, is very much informed, unsurprisingly, given that it's written by 2 Jesuits, informed by this practice of Ignatian spirituality, which is noticing what God is doing, noticing how God is looking at me, noticing what happens in me as I notice God looking at me. And it's really that dialogue between paying attention to what's happening in myself and paying attention to what's happening in God as I'm noticing. And so the picture on the right then is a picture taken just over a year ago. In fact, almost exactly a year ago, because it's graduation week at my university this week, and that's of course me in a graduation gown. And it's that thing of what that invitation to notice, and what does that mean in the context, particularly of academic conversation. And I think it's important, I think to recognize my experience of academia has been that I think South Africa is far more forgiving of those who have a religious faith than academia in the US. My experience of my very limited experience of academia in the US has been that my experience in the US has been very much that those two worlds shall remain completely separate. And really, you shouldn't mention the embarrassing thing that you might believe in God in those spaces. In South Africa, I think it's a slightly kinder environment, but it's still an environment where talking about these things in an intellectual space, talking about the things, the nature of God, or indeed belief in God, is seen as a curiosity at best. And so with the experience that I've had where I've sort of taught theology and taught in a chemistry department and taught education, and I do all sorts of things, from an academic point of view, realizing some years ago that my CV looks actually quite problematic. It looks like I can't quite make up my mind what I'm trying to do. But I think the more I've been able to integrate these different facets of my life, the more I've realized that they really are an asset. And so turning now to spiritual conversation and what I want to say with that. So I've sort of exemplified these with 3 people from my own life. 2 of the photos I took myself. The one in the middle I didn't, simply because the photo of I didn't have a good photo of the person in the middle. But so I'll start on the left with a friend of mine, a woman called Nan Martin. Nan is about 20 years my senior. And for a while, there was a year in which, just after I'd returned to Cape Town, I was looking for a spiritual director. I hadn't quite found anybody yet. She was also on her own search at the time. She also has made the spiritual exercises and a trained spiritual director herself. And so we committed to going for walks together. And so we would go to, for those of you who know Cape Town, we would go to Kirstenbosch National Botanical Gardens, and we would go for a walk usually on a Sunday afternoon, for formal spiritual conversation. We would take turns talking and kind of talking about what was happening for us on a spiritual level. And I think when I think about spiritual conversation, that's the first image that comes to mind. It's that not quite, I mean, we agreed on it quite formally. I found myself many times kind of stumbling into that kind of conversation. When I've been in conversation with friends, sort of stumbling into that space without trying to. But again, with this, what's particular about that conversation is the curiosity of just gently taking what is said at face value and saying, tell me more. And what's that like? And how is that for God? And how is that for you? And what does that feel like in your body? And those sorts of questions that are typical spiritual direction questions. But when you're in that kind of contemplative mode, they're very, particularly if you're talking with somebody who's used to being asked those sorts of questions, they're very easy conversations, very easy questions to ask, and are useful questions to try to answer. Certainly, I find them useful to answer. So that's the first kind of spiritual conversation, and I think I would be very surprised if those gathering tonight were not familiar with that kind of conversation. The second one is one that is again, it has a formality to it. It's the conversation that I recognize, and the person photographed in the middle there is a man called Dermot Preston, a Jesuit. In fact, the person who directed me through the spiritual exercises. But the kind of conversation that I associate with an older person and a younger person, usually a younger person seeking out, and certainly I did this a lot when I was young, seeking out somebody who I thought might know a little bit more than me in terms of kind of meaning of life kind of stuff. And inevitably, often the people that I sought out for those conversations were priests and religious sisters, and more often than not, those conversations ended up becoming explicit about God and prayer and those sorts of things, and were very, very much mentoring kind of conversations. And now, as I'm older myself, finding younger people seeking me out for that kind of conversation. So very much a more formal kind of mentoring, almost one could imagine helping people with tools of how to pray and those sorts of things in that second type of conversation. And then the third type, the third person pictured there is also a Jesuit called Mike Lewis, who is currently the tertian master for he's tertian master in South Africa, but it's actually for the African Conference of Jesuits. And Mike and I became friends in 2018, began to have, again, coffee together around about once a month or so. And we stumbled into a different kind of conversation, which is really brought up as the reason that I'm giving this talk this evening, which is what I'll call intellectual conversation. But it had a very similar feel to it. And that was, I remember very clearly, I was talking to him about some ideas I had about education. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, but you haven't proved it yet." And it's not, I didn't quite take the bait at the time, but within about 18 months or so, I was doing a second PhD in education to prove my point. But it was the beauty of that conversation was that Mike didn't know terribly much about my field of expertise. He had worked in seminaries and did know things about teaching, but he knew very little about science, and certainly the kinds of teaching that I was talking about, he was not familiar with, but he was curious. And he would say to me, "Well, tell me more about that. And what exactly do you mean? And how does that connect with what you were talking about last time we met?" And when I got over enthusiastic, saying, hang on a minute, but you haven't proved it. And so it was really in reflecting on the conversations that I had with Mike, realizing that there was another kind of conversation that I found myself slipping into with my academic peers. And it wouldn't happen very often, and it only usually happened with people with whom I had a good rapport. I would find myself asking, kind of slipping into intellectual spiritual conversation. And for a good few years, I found myself wondering what the connection between these two kinds of conversation were. Was it a kind of spiritual conversation where one just didn't mention God? And if you don't mention God, does it count as spiritual conversation? And finally, just accepting the fact that I think it is spiritual conversation. And the connection is wonder. I think wonder is the thing. If we go back to sort of those two, that practice of spiritual direction, as described by Barry and Connolly, those questions of what one is looking for when you're sitting in the spiritual director's seat are the moments of life, the moments of energy, the moments of connection, those moments where you can just feel there's something here. And asking the person just to say a little bit more. And the purpose there of saying a little bit more is so that the remembered experience comes to life again. So as you talk about it, you can almost viscerally I feel these things very viscerally, and you can sort of, when I'm on the receiving end of this kind of conversation and I'm responding to the questions, you can kind of feel the memory taking flesh, if you like. Flesh and my own flesh in a sense. You can almost feel the embodiment of that memory dropping from the memory into the body. And the way that Barry and Connolly describe it, and Rob Marsh also has some very good sort of goes on from Barry and Connolly, and he has some very good articles also in The Way, which is the spirituality journal published by the British Jesuits, where there's a sense in which one moves from remembered experience to embodied experience to live encounter. The sense that I'm not just talking to you about a moment of encounter with God that happened to me 2 days ago. I'm now, it's now embodied. And as I begin to talk about it, it takes on a new dynamism. So there may be, the conversation may go on, it may take me in different directions, whatever that may be. And in intellectual conversation, there's a similar kind of a thing. And I find myself saying, oh, tell me a little bit more about that. What's that like? Does that connect to other stuff that you're interested in? And there's something important about in that, the quality of attention, which is daring to say, what if we just take this at face value? What if we just take this? Let's not worry about whether this is true or not. Let's just run with it and see where it takes us. We can ask the discerning question at the end, but for a moment, let's just take the energy. Let's trust the energy and see where it takes us. And so there's something about the freedom that can be evoked in those conversations. It depends on the environment, in the intellectual environment in which one is working. But sometimes in academia, conversations can be quite combative is too strong a word, but critique is brought in too quickly, right? To say, yes, but what if? Or how about we look at it from this direction? And in this kind of intellectual conversation, simply to say, let's just take it, let's run with it and see how far it takes us. And once we've seen how far it takes us, we can then look back and say, okay, does this actually hold? And if we look at it from this perspective, does it hold? And if we look at it from this perspective, does it hold? So in a sense, for me, how that was embodied for me, Mike's challenged me, yes, but you haven't proved it yet, came after maybe an hour of conversation of exploring this thing, right? So the challenge was important, but it came right at the end of really exploring the possibilities of pursuing this particular line of thought. And I think we don't often afford one another that space to say, I'm going to sit with you and let you explore this and see where it takes you. And I'm going to take it not incredulously, but if I am sitting with somebody who I know actually does have the capacity to critique or does have the capacity to discern, I'm going to give you this little beautiful space where we can just find our way together for a little bit and not worry too much about how we defend the space that we're creating. We're just going to create a space, and then we can think about the discernment around the space. So I think discernment, this picture, obviously, it's a sort of classic picture of, which road to take. discernment's always going to be a part of the process. And as one is listening, as you are the one who is listening, one is discerning. And the things that I'm looking for is sort of where's the energy, where's the life, where's the sense of connection. But there's a part of me that just says, I'm not going to worry too much about what this means. I'm just going to take this moment as it is, right? I'm just going to let, a phrase I often use in spiritual direction, let God be God. Let's see where this goes. And then at the end, we're going to figure out the implications of what it is that we're saying here. And so I think this has implications for everyday life. Sorry, the point at the end, you may need to switch roles at some point. And the point that I want to make there is that, you know, Mike's question to me at the end, but you haven't proved anything yet. Sooner or later, one has to see whether, so in Ignatian spirituality, when we're thinking about helping somebody trying to make a decision or whatever, the decision is only confirmed when one interacts with real life, right? It's not, the interaction with real life is an important part of the discernment process. So likewise, intellectually, with intellectual spiritual conversation, sooner or later you have to see how this beautiful idea that you've created does actually interact with the real world, whether that's testing it in the laboratory or whether that is constructing the counter arguments so that you can formulate a good paper to make your argument. Doesn't really matter. One needs, for an idea to be a good idea, it has to be accepted by the community in a sense. It has to, certainly intellectually, one has, peer review is an important part of the process. One has to get your paper published, which means that it has to be accepted by other people who have the capacity to critique this paper. An idea, and certainly for an idea to take hold, it needs a community to say, yes, we are going to move forward with this idea. And so obviously there are differences, important differences between spiritual conversation and intellectual conversation. And for the vast majority of the conversations that I have, which I would consider intellectual spiritual conversation, God never gets a mention. If the other person brings it up, I'm happy to continue it down that road. But for the most part, that's not the purpose. The purpose is not evangelism. The purpose is helping the person develop this idea. And I guess the underlying, the sort of the point of departure there is the presumption that the Spirit of God is present and active in every person, and that there's something about one is presuming that the intellectual endeavor that most people who are practicing academics are doing this for the good of the community in some way. It's obviously for their own interest and satisfaction, but that one's own deepest desire is God's desire for us. So I think it's Fred Buechner who says, oh, I'm going to horribly misquote it now, but your calling is where your deep desire and the world's need meet one another. And so I think for even the most ivory tower of academics would think that there is value in this intellectual pursuit. And so there is value into pursuing into there's value and integrity in this pursuit. And so from that foundation, I think one can see this as vocational. And I think just as sort of a bit of a sidebar there, is that, you know, for myself, I worked as a PhD. I got my PhD in chemistry, and then left chemistry to become a spiritual director, thinking that that was going to be my life's work, and then found myself coming back to chemistry and trying to make sense of what vocation meant for me. And really, in the end, coming to the sense of actually, this is God's calling too. It's not nearly so obvious as a sort of religious vocation, but it is God's calling too, and one can operate very much in that sense. So I think as I'm talking here, you can see how sort of these different threads of my life are very much interwoven, and inextricably linked. It's part of my self-understanding that this is part of my vocation. And so how does this translate into daily life? I think the thing that is perhaps the most important is when it's a bit of a change of gear to where we're talking to somebody sort of in daily life. And particularly if we're talking to somebody who holds a very different opinion to us, and I think one can think of various political situations where that may hold. And these suggestions may not, or certainly the first position may not be a good starting point. If it isn't a good starting point, this conversation may not be worth having. But if I can believe that the person that I'm talking to has really thought about their position, then actually there's lots to be curious about. Like, what was their starting point? How did they come to this position? It's really curious when you meet a smart person who holds a very different position to you, and to say, hey, wow, I think really differently to you. And I can respect that you've not come to your point lightly. Let's talk, because I actually do want to understand how you can think the way that you do. Because if I can understand how you think the way that you do, that may actually challenge some of my presumptions and may help me to think through why I hold the position that I do. And maybe I might not be quite as convinced about my own position. Maybe I might not. But the point is that in having that conversation from that point of view, we can both leave the conversation having learned something and having a better understanding of why it is that someone might actually hold a different position. Because in this very, very, very polarized world that we live in, nuance is dead. And actually listening, chatting with somebody who has thought about stuff, we begin to discover that actually nuance is where all of the interesting stuff lies. Nuance is where our humanity lies. So there's something profoundly challenging about that. Obviously, if one can only have that quality of conversation if you really do, you can't fake respect, right? So one can only have that conversation if you actually do respect the person that you're talking to. I think the crucial thing in those conversations, just going back to thinking about my own experience of giving 8-day retreats, where I thought I knew it was what, the retreat was going to be about this thing. is recognizing that those conversations aren't about convincing the other person that you're right. It's not about one person winning and the other person losing. It's about both people going away with a better understanding of what the other side thinks. And having learned that the person on the other side is truly human, and that they're smart and thoughtful and care about things. They may not care exactly, they may not care about the things that I care about to the extent that I care about them, but you're probably going to come away having a better understanding of what it is that's important to them. And once you know what's important to them, then new possibilities arise. So I think that stance is vitally important, and it's in our polarized world. I think those sorts of conversations are only possible in person. I think it's very difficult. Certainly, it's impossible to have those conversations on social media. But to dare to have those conversations with the people that we presume are in conflict with us, I think is an important part. And I think the two second points, the second and third points that I put up there, what motivates their choices? Not just what do they think, but why? And when I ask them why, it forces me to ask myself, well, why do I think the way that I do? What is the motivation there? Because I think oftentimes we can take on a stance for particular reasons, and 10 years later, we're still holding the same stance, but we've changed a lot and the world has changed a lot. And are the motivations still the same? Let's challenge ourselves to ask ourselves why. And I think fundamentally approaching those conversations as what can I learn, not how do I prove the other person wrong? How do I, there's so much to be learned from good conversation with an intelligent person that does not think the same way that you do. Because if nothing else, it'll hone your own thinking. And so as I come to the end, I always speak slightly shorter than than I'm given time. I hope my brevity will be applauded, not rather than anything else. But I hope what I've done tonight is just given you a sense of, I come from a space where people say to me, well, how do you hold together science and spirituality? And my answer is, I don't see why they're in conflict. I don't. I think that there's a lot that one can learn in different ways from each of them. And every time I've had the opportunity to have that conversation with somebody who's truly interested, I've learned something about my own position too. So this quality of conversation is probably not going to happen in the grocery store line, but you'll find the people with whom you can have these conversations. And when you stumble into the more you practice them, the more it shapes your way of being in the world, because it shapes every encounter into, wow, I can be curious about this person, rather than who are they and do they belong to my group or do they not, or are they, however you align that. It's certainly those 4 years that I spent in the retreat house, working in the retreat house, completely shaped my way of being in the world in a way that I still cannot quite describe. But I hope tonight I've shown you that it's infused my academic career and continues to inform who I am in the world. So that's what I have for you this evening. I hope it's given you some food for thought.
Wonderful, Mags. Thank you so much for that delightful lecture. There's an awful lot to think about. So I'm hoping when we're going, the next step is to go into the breakout rooms for a short conversation with other participants. And when you come back, we'll have some questions for Mags or comments. So in the meantime, if you would write any comment or question that you have in the chat, might be easier even to write it then. These are interesting topics. We might not all have been thinking along this line. So that will be the next step. But I just wanted to say one of the things about Teilhard that I'm always so happy about is he calls research, and he was a scientist, he calls research an act of adoration. And I think this is what you're talking about. It's like, no matter what we're talking about, if we can share at a level where we're really getting to the heart of matter, that's the point. It's not always easy, but researchers do that. There's nothing like being in a heated conversation with researchers, back and forth and back and forth, back and forth, until they get to something that works. So how about if I ask Alex to send us to the breakout rooms, and we'll be back in about 15 minutes, okay? Ralph says, I'm reminded of a thought by Titus Brandsma, a Roman Catholic priest executed by the Nazis in World War II. He says, prayer is life, not an oasis in the desert of life. So Mags, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that for me, that phrase, it's also associated with Franciscan spirituality, but I associate it with Ignatian spirituality of finding God in all things.
Mm-hmm.
We must find God in all things. If God is all in all, then God must be as much in the laboratory as on the prayer stool. I think it has to be like that. And certainly my experience of encounter with God is like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think that's very true. And then let's see, Ralph has another comment. Thank you. Or question, I'm not sure. Listening is an art form, which I think you made clear. Words are metaphors that point to a greater reality. As Joseph Campbell would say, all conversations are part of eternity. Tonight's talk reminds me that I must strive to be creative while being created.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that for me, that reminder that words, even our language associated with God, is a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
And not the older I get, that and sort of the more I pursue various things intellectually, the more I recognize that we have to be very careful not to equate epistemology with ontology, not to equate our language about God and our concepts about God with God.
Mm-hmm.
They're always going to fall short. They're always going to be limited.
Mm-hmm.
And so not to be afraid of exploring concepts, because God will always be greater than the concepts. The concepts may be tremendously useful, but they're just concepts. So not to make idols of our explanations.
Mm-hmm. Good. And when we do, sometimes it's disaster, because we find the image that we use is something that's negative for us, you know. Somebody else might think it's great,
Yeah.
you know. So it is important to be careful. Let me see now, Margaret. You said 3 levels of spiritual encounter. Memorize prayer, remember, memorize prayer, embody conversation with God, and life encounters, sitting and noticing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I think, you know, you kind of talked about those, right? That seems like a good way to look at it. You know, there's so many different ways, yeah. But these are different levels. And then here, can you please comment on how your in-depth study of chemistry has informed your own sense of God and practice of spiritual direction?
A great question. I think so. 2 things come to mind immediately. The first is, and I think both of them are experiences of wonder. And I think that's so for me, these things are deeply connected. The first is my field of chemistry was synthetic organic chemistry, and I was making small molecules as potential antimalarial compounds. And I remember standing in the lab one day holding a small vial of crystalline material. And it was a small vial of a molecule that, to my knowledge, had never been made before, and I just made it. And what that did for me, I come from I'm the 5th child in, you know, a good Catholic family, and most of my siblings are much more creative than I am. In that moment, I discovered that I was creative in a remarkably different way, in a very structured, very methodical, very meticulous kind of a way. But in that moment, I discovered my creativity. And it's that recognition that science, particularly chemistry, has this remarkable creative capacity. We get to be part. Look, not all of the creation of chemistry has been useful. And, you know, if you think about microplastics and all of those kind of things, it hasn't all been good, but there is something remarkable about being part of the creative energy. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is that the study of chemistry itself has also been, I love the fact that I look at the world in a slightly different way, because I know that the world is made of molecules. So when I see ice floating in water, solids are usually more dense than their liquid form, except ice floats in water. And it's because of this incredible thing called hydrogen bonding, which pushes the water molecules apart when they freeze, which has meant that life on Earth continues. So there's a level at which being able to view the world through a molecular lens helps me to see the wonder in creation in a particular way. So those are just sort of 2 things. I'm sure I could go on, but I'll leave it there for this evening.
Okay, good. And someone said she can't find, Mia can't find the link to the article. And if you scroll up on the chat, I think it's maybe the 3rd or 4th entry. And it
Yes.
starts out with, you can find my paper in the way. So hopefully you were able to find it.
So that link will send you to basically the search page, where if you just put in my surname as Blackie under the author, in the author box, it'll the papers that I've written for the way will pop up.
Oh, maybe that's what you needed to know. Okay. I see academics versus academia versus spirituality, similar to science, religion and spirituality.
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding you rightly there, I think that there's I think we get caught in our little tribes of, you know, what counts as being acceptable in different categories. And we, as humans, we are fully category seeking creatures, and we want to define what is what, and therefore what doesn't belong. And I think if we take spirituality seriously, spirituality infuses everything. But it's going to look quite different in different spaces. So you get sort of authentic versions of spirituality or non-authentic versions of spirituality. I think if people are trying to find truth and connection, if spirituality isn't leading to connection, then I think we're in trouble. I think it should lead to the capacity to transcend boundaries in one way or another. And so anything that needs to be strongly boundaried, like academia or like religion, is going to find spirituality a little bit threatening. Yeah.
Good. So here's a question from Jason Willis. Our breakout tossed around tips for breaking through the typical exchange called conversation and arrive at a place with the safety and space necessary to discuss spiritual depth as two thrilled practitioners of spiritual depth. Any tips?
Yeah, I mean, I do find myself tipping into these conversations quite often. All it requires is for one person to be curious, and to recognize that those conversations are not likely to be fully mutual, in that you're gonna not at the same time, right? One person is going to be the person who is curious about the other person's experience. And it can switch after a while, but it's very difficult to be mutually to take experience to a new depth for both of you at the same time, having different experiences. So I think it does take one person saying, I'm going to be in service of the other for a little while. And if the other person is astute enough, they'll return the favor. But I don't think you can do it for one another. So when I spoke about my experience of spiritual conversation with Nan, essentially on the walk out, she would talk, and on the walk back, I would talk, or the other way around, depending on who had the more pressing pressing thing to say to start with. I think it's not going to be mutual at the same time. If that makes sense.
I think that does make sense, right? Especially if you're not talking about the same experience.
Yeah,
If it is the same experience, there's probably something more that can happen.
absolutely.
Patrick Macaulay says the way you talk about the interaction between spirituality and science seems so easy and light. It seems that you have let go of common understandings of God so as to make room for this non-adversarial coexistence of science and faith. What do you think about that? Is that something that you
Yeah, it's an astute observation, Patrick. I think that that is right to some extent. And I think that goes back to what I was saying about the concepts of God and God. So I think that if we take our concepts of God as being true and absolute, if we conflate those two things, we can take our concepts a little bit too seriously. So I think the concepts are tremendously useful. So I myself am a practicing Roman Catholic. The concepts are tremendously useful, and you can't really divorce things like our understanding of sin, our understanding of baptism, and our understanding of what's happening in the crucifixion. You can't really disentangle those things because they're all interrelated in different ways. And I think that whole system points to an understanding of a loving, engaged, communicative God, there might be a different system that also communicates that reality.
Mhm.
So it's this conceptual domain that has grown up into the religious dogma that we now have. I hold the dogma quite lightly. I hold my relationship with God extremely seriously, but I'm not going to pull at the edges and say I accept this bit of dogma, but not that bit of dogma. Because as soon as you pick and choose, ah, the system is useful, but don't mistake the system for God. Is the position that I take.
Mm. That sounds wise. Thank you. Margaret Leonard wants to know, do you look at the ego and the soul and see where our ego stops conversation and our soul is comfortably curious, I suppose that is.
That's a great way of articulating it. I've never really yeah, it's just a great way of articulating it. And I think that that's probably true, because the ego wants identity, right? And this is the reality. So the ego tends to want to box things. And I see you're pointing to Richard Rohr there, and I think the other book that's particularly useful there is his Falling Upwards, where it's looking at in the first half of life the need to define things quite clearly, and in the second half of life letting that go. And I think definitely, much like the distinction I was speaking earlier on about religion and spirituality, the ego tends to be much more boundaried and want things with a particular identity and clarity around that, where the soul or the spirit can be more willing to follow its nose. And I think if we I think I guess with all of these things, I take the whole, I take God, I take the journey extremely seriously, but I take any particular thing, I hold the particular things quite lightly. And I think that affords the possibility for a really good conversation. Because if I can hold my own concept quite lightly, then hey, I'm willing to explore intellectually the way your concept. And it doesn't mean that I'm letting go of my way of being.
Hmm.
Sorry, I segued slightly on that one.
Good. So Laura Craig said members in our group agreed that the concepts you provided for speaking with the other are in line with nonviolent communication as taught by Marshall Rosenberg. Are you familiar with NVC or?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with it in that I've heard of it. But beyond that, I'm not. But it doesn't surprise me at all in what I know of NBC. I see that alignment fully, and yeah, I think these days anything that can help us communicate from one human being to another and see the other person as human is going to be a good thing, because we seem to be losing that ability quite horribly.
Thank you. I think we have a few more minutes. If anybody has a question, you want to put your hand up, we can let you ask the question or give the comment. But I need to see your hand. If either there's this, oh, Margaret, go ahead, but unmute yourself first. Either you can
Thank
do
you so
that
much.
or
I was
this.
looking for the hand, but that's great. I get it's easier than writing it to just say it.
It
And I'm
is.
not a scientist, but I know from science class in high school that there is a specific process, and when you're doing an experiment, you're writing your lab report in a way that it can be reproduced. And that if people follow the certain steps, you're going to get the same result without telling them that they have to believe in the result, because you can let them just follow the steps to get that result. And I think that for me, where I really found a connection with God is through the 12-step programs, where nobody came in and told me I have to believe something specific and this is how it has to be. They just said, well, here are the steps, and we're here with you on your journey in a non-judging way. And that was when I discovered what God was, because I was allowed to do it in my space, in my way, in a curious way, and not feeling rushed or feeling like I needed to recite something or else. And so that's kind of like how I see it. Was Jung who originally talked about the ego and the soul and the unconscious and the conscious, and his psychology of the unconscious, and how it's mainly culture that causes us to suppress our unconscious. And when we're like told that we're supposed to do things a certain way, or we're evil, we're sinners, Richard Rohr explains it as actually sin is being addiction and being, caught up in our own egos, really. And that's I see that the way you describe that you do your leadership and your spiritual directing is that you're giving space to come to what you know already is the answer, but but you also on their journey. I mean, how lucky are you that you got to spend 8 days multiple times a month to go on that journey and learn even more, because every time you learn something, that's so cool.
Great, Margaret.
Thank you.
We have a question here from, I think it's a question or comment, from Cindy Kramer. The teachings of Laudato Si are a beautiful way to look at integral ecology and the inseparable blending of science and faith. Social and environmental issues are one and the same.
Yeah, it's a great document, that, and I fully recommend the reading of it. It's and I think so necessary for our time.
Yeah, it's really a very important piece. And then Catherine Cherry talks about her first scientific question at age 7 was, Teilhard has his first at 5. So you're just a couple years later. Very important, I think. But your question was, what is color? Yet it was totally tied into an awe of God. Even now, I am always in awe of God's idea to make snow white in a dark time of our region of the world. Can you comment? Color, that's a chemistry topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, anything that initiates or has the capacity to move us into prayer and has the capacity to move us into connection with God. Quite how creation happens and how things are God's ideas or not is a conversation for another day. But I really do think that there is such wonder. You walk down, I'm in Massachusetts at the moment, and it's trying hard to be spring. And you see kind of the buds that are about to become leaves. I mean, we're about to have a big cold snap, so maybe not this week, but they're primed to burst full of life, and they'll do so in the next few weeks. That's amazing. That's an incredible thing to happen, and it happens every year. And just like this, and just seeing the daffodils are also blooming at the moment. The capacity, that Mary Oliver kind of quality of attention, of just allowing oneself to see what is, and to appreciate its beauty and complexity. And if you've got scientific understanding, you can understand that at a whole other depth as well, which is part of why I love being a scientist. So I think there's something to allow ourselves to pausing and noticing is a religious practice, is a prayer practice. And I continually try to do it and fail. I would like to do it more often than I remember to, because it is, it's how we connect with our world, it's how we connect with each other, it's how we connect with God. So yeah, particularly that the beauty of snow in the winter. It's a great image.
Mm. Yeah, and so important, isn't it, to have a question,
Yeah,
to keep yourself curious, you
yeah.
know? And Teilhard worked with that question all his life.
Mm, mm,
And not until he was ready to die did he really feel he had the answer.
mm,
But he had answers, you know,
mm,
always
mm,
answers, always something.
mm.
And we have one more comment from Ralph. He says, in the
That's great.
21st century, humankind needs AI. Now, I'm sure everybody's going to get jittery, but he calls it audacious imagination.
I love it. I love
Yeah,
it. I think I'll take that away with me from this evening, Ralph. Thank you for that.
yeah, that's
So
wonderful.
great.
So that might be a good note to end on. But
Mm.
Max, it's really been great having you. I'm so grateful that you were able to be here so that we don't have to do this like in the middle of the night, or you
Yeah.
don't have to do it the night.
No, thank you so much for the invitation.
And we'll have the recording too eventually, and we can, you know, we'll share it with you. You might want to go back over. I was thinking of that, like there were a lot of good points there. You know, I don't know that I really got them all the first time through. And they're all so valuable. I think this topic is extremely valuable. But before we leave, I want to remind you that if you are not on our mailing list, and would like to be, all you have to do is send me an email to that effect. And I think Alex is going to put up the information. Yes, there it is. That's for the Institute. Just send me an email. If you get mail from me, from the Institute, then you don't need to do that. And if you wish to join the American Teilhard Association, you must go to the website. So you have to become a member. But you can find my email address as well as the web addresses for the Institute and the ATA on the screen and in the chat. I guess they're in the chat, I'm not sure. Next, I would like to share with you coming events. This one is sponsored by the American Teilhard Association. So this year, distinguished Celtic spirituality master John Philip Newell will be the keynote speaker for our American Teilhard Association's annual meeting. And he will be with us on Zoom. The event is scheduled for June 1. It's from noon until 2, Eastern Daylight Time, of course. And Newell will be highlighting principles in Celtic spirituality found in the works of Teilhard. So he's going to make some connections with his own work and Teilhard's. And then we are also providing an opportunity during that weekend for an in-person retreat from May 31st to June 2nd at Dalesford Abbey in Paoli. So if you would like to come and join us, we'll be, you know, processing this material, taking time for reflection, prayer, conversation, and all that, and for fun too. So if you can join us, that would be terrific. And you'll find on our website, you can find the registration. And then once again, I want to thank you for your attention and for your good questions and comments and for your continued support of our efforts. We wouldn't be able to do this if nobody came. So it's great to have you. And I also want to thank Mags Blackie for a wonderful presentation. I think really we're really blessed to be listening to something like that, especially in this day and age when conversation is difficult. So maybe little by little, we can implement some of those things. I think we've learned a lot and we still have much to ponder about the conversations. So until we meet again, thank you very much for coming and have a wonderful rest of the day. All right. Thank you.